industry and its turbulent past that has come to shape the industry as we know it. Unity remains a pervasive challenge in the industry, and the Goldstone Commission of Inquiry to the Nzemeza Commission looked into the issue of violence in the taxi industry. It is imperative that disincentives for violence and conflict be introduced across the system. We want the Lekgotla to consider, among others, binding provision in law should where an individual operator may forfeit their license. We cannot continue on the same trajectory. Firstly, we have the institutional arrangement in as far as leadership is concerned. And thirdly, does the regulatory framework provide sufficient? Lastly, is there sufficient accountability? In addressing these challenges, the Lekgotla will reflect on these matters. Thank you very much. Briefly with those comments, in terms of what the Lekgotla seeks to do and to achieve, we need a deal out of this Lekgotla between government and the taxi industry to formalize, to agree on formalization, to agree on regulation, and also to agree on the economic empowerment that include subsidization of the taxi industry. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister Mbalula. I think those words are quite pertinent. It just reminds me of a saying that there's a common misconception that unity means the absence of disagreement, but that could not be further from the truth, because to the contrary, or on the contrary, unity is the ability to work through areas of disagreement, past the disagreement towards a solution, and of course bound by common purpose and the desire to achieve the same goal. So all the stakeholders in the taxi industry, I'm sure, all agree that they desire to see a taxi industry that is successful, that is prosperous, that is thriving, that is sustainable, and it is that common goal that will see unity come to pass. And with that premise, I think we're off to a very good start. President Tabosh, perhaps let's hear from you and get the industry's perspective. Santaco President Philip Tabosh, the floor is yours, sir. Mr. Tabosh, we cannot hear you at the moment. I believe your mic is still on mute, which is a good thing unless you need to speak to us. And I think now is the time when you can unmute it for us, please. Thank you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, sir. Go ahead.
Yeah, I was just recognizing the Minister, Dr. Mkonyama, Dr. Moyani, and Professor Tuli Madonsela, and yourself, Ayanda, as the Program Director. I think as a taxi industry, we actually, I must actually say to the then apartheid government that they didn't know what kind of a favor were they doing to a Black person in South Africa when they separated from all these amenities. If you remember, the Group Areas Act is the one which caused the birth of the taxi industry in South Africa. And it also ensured that we were in a way participating in ensuring that there is true liberation into our country. For that, we want to say that with the progressiveness that is taking place within the taxi industry, we want to thank the ruling party government when it came to our rescue through the NTT program, which the minister has related to, and that created a platform for the taxi industry to say that, to say to government, what is it that the taxi industry would need to be done for them to operate as a public transporter very freely and also in the constraints of the law. I want to thank Minister Fikile Mbalula for coming up with this issue of the public discourse because at one stage, I must be honest to say, I didn't understand what the minister is saying, and I got confused. And as we interact further, the entire taxi industry is today convinced that Mr. Fikile Mbalula is actually coming with a medicine which would change the industry for the better. You must remember that we established a united taxi industry in 2001 via the late minister, may soul rest in peace, Minister Dala Omar. And since then, we have been trying to change the taxi industry. We have, the Santaco was actually minister built on 3 pillars, which the first pillar was to ensure that the taxi industry is united. And the second pillar was to ensure that there is eradication of violence. And the last pillar was, which is a very, something which is on the heart of the minister, it is the economic emancipation of the taxi industry. And Minister, I want to indicate on behalf of the entire taxi industry in the country, we are welcoming Lekgotla, and I want to thank your provinces, the MECs, for already having had some Lekgotlas in their provinces in preparation for the national Lekgotla. So the taxi industry is ready for the professionalization, is ready for the regulation. Minister must indicate, we've been requesting for limited regulatory powers, and I must indicate that the minister is putting his feet on that. And I must qualify by saying that the taxi industry is not looking at becoming a government, but the taxi industry is looking at becoming a body that can govern the taxi industry in such a way that whenever anybody in the taxi industry, including a passenger, when somebody is out of order, that we can take the necessary steps to ensure continuous respect for each other, both the commuters, and I want to thank the commuters of South Africa for having supported the taxi industry in all these years, even at the time when we have done them very bad. And I want to use this opportunity to apologize on behalf of the taxi drivers in the country and on behalf of the taxi owners for all the bad things that we have done to you as passengers in this country. And, you know, we've killed you, we have undermined you, but you kept giving us the support. And I'm looking at this particular taxi Lekgotla as to empower the taxi industry in such a way that it can begin to say when a taxi driver has transgressed or when a taxi operator has transgressed, the necessary disciplinary action and which will be binding can be taken. Thank you very much, Minister.
Thank you so much, President Taibosh. And I think also, if I may take the liberty of thanking you on behalf of commuters as well, to say, you know, it's so important that one recognizes when one errs, because to err is human. But more importantly, what you said subsequent to that is what I think many commuters are looking out for. That consequence, how do we prevent such issues from reoccurring here today? And those are some of the issues that we'll thrash out. But I must thank you. And also just pick up on a point that you had mentioned there about the provincial Lekgotlas that are already underway. Mr. Mbalula was in the Western Cape for their provincial Lekgotla with the MEC there, Mr. Matikizela. And you know, he said something very important. MEC Matikizela said the world was watching when it comes to this particular gathering, this intervention, but not so much an eager expectation for progress, but to see whether or not we will do what we said we will do and whether or not success will come to pass. And I think it was quite important that he spurred all of those in the taxi industry on to say we need to have all hands on deck, and that is the only way that we'll ensure that success is not only inevitable, but that it is nigh. And so we have used a combination of factors, and you'll know this, President Taibosh, we have used both a bottom-up and a top-down approach. approach, having spoken to operators, having spoken to those in the value chain of the taxi industry, but also those in academia, those who have written and who have studied at length on the matter of public transport in general and taxi industry in particular. So let me perhaps introduce some of our panelists who will come to us with that particular angle now, having done their research. I would like to also send a special word of welcome to Dr. Lekgotla. I can see that Moyana, pardon me, he's with us as well. A very good afternoon to you. Welcome. Thank you so much. I know you had a few technical glitches. Let me greet you and also greet Professor Tuli Madonsela, who also was experiencing one or two gremlins in the system, but is able to join us. Ladies and gentlemen, if you may bear with me, please, I'm going to read each bio. I think it's important to do justice to their profile so as to also glean some context which will aid us in our discussion. I'm going to start off with the profile of Dr. Mateta Mokonyama, who is currently leading the transport systems and operations area at the CSIR. He holds a degree in civil engineering from the University of Witwatersrand, as well as a master's and PhD in transportation engineering, that is from the University of Pretoria. He has previously worked for the city of Johannesburg and in private civil engineering consultancy in the areas of transport, of planning, transport modeling, traffic engineering, as well as development engineering. And I know some people like myself are also smiling and thinking, we did not know there was something called traffic engineering. I guess you learn something new every day. The doctor has also published peer-reviewed technical papers, as well as book chapters on topics related to transport operations and modeling. He has also consulted on the topics of transport planning and operations for all spheres of government in South Africa and for international clients, such as the International Association of Public Transport. His research includes the modeling of the dynamic needs of public transport customers and the specification of their needs in public transport service contracts and service design. He is a registered professional engineer with the Engineering Council of South Africa. It's such a pleasure to have you in our midst, Doc. Thank you very much. I'm also just going to quickly read the bio of Dr. Lekgotla Moyana. The doctor currently works as an executive training and development at the Road Traffic Management Corporation, otherwise known as RTMC. It is an agency of the South African Department of Transport that's responsible for road traffic management and safety. He also serves as an external examiner at the Department of Transport, Economics, Logistics and Tourism of the University of South Africa. And Dr. Lekgotla does research in welfare economics, supply chain management, and transport economics. His current project is a hybrid framework for assessing the cost of road crashes in South Africa. That is something that's absolutely pivotal, especially if you look at the statistics of the carnage on South Africa's roads. And then the last, but definitely not least, of the panelists who joins us this afternoon is Professor Tuli Madonsela. She is the Law Trust Chair in Social Justice and Law Professor at the University of Stellenbosch, and that's where she conducts and coordinates social justice research, and she teaches constitutional and administrative law. She is also the founder of the Tuma Foundation, and that's an independent democracy leadership and literacy social enterprise. Professor is an advocate of the High Court as well of South Africa. You'll remember her for being a lifelong activist on social justice, on constitutionalism, human rights, good governance, and the rule of law. She was named as one of Time's 100 most influential people in the world, and that is just one of the many, many accolades that she has gleaned. She just completed her 7-year term as South Africa's public protector, and I think we could wax lyrical about her many accomplishments. It's a great pleasure to have her as well as the other panelists with us. Thank you very much. This is where we miss out on the physical face-to-face contact, because at this point I would say, can we please get a round of applause? But I'm sure you are feeling welcome and you are feeling much appreciated. Thank you very much for reserving this time to share with us on such an important matter. The taxi industry is an industry that has a long history of empowerment for Black South Africans. It has a proud history of being one of the surviving industries that have traversed some of the travesties of the apartheid government and still stand tall today. As we heard from President Taibosh, that it's an industry that enjoys support from a wide range of South Africans. It is an industry that has so much potential. Minister Mbalula always calls it a sunrise industry. So let's perhaps start there. Let's talk a little bit about trying to find the lasting solutions to this industry's challenges, especially as they pertain to unity and leadership. Before I ask any questions, I'm going to ask perhaps that our panelists give us a 5 to 10 minute opener just to share their views on this particular theme. Dr. Mokonyama, let me start with you.
All right, thank you, Program Director, Honorable Minister, Fikile Mbalula, the fellow panelists, Dr. Moyane and Professor Madonsela, and ladies and gentlemen. You know, seeing that it's a Sunday, perhaps I should begin with a very famous story, that of someone called a sower. They say a sower went out to sow. And as this sower was sowing these seeds, some fell by the wayside, right? And the birds came and, you know, gobbled up. Some fell on rocky ground, and the seeds just, disappeared, essentially died. And then some fell on some other ground with thorns, and they were, strangled. The storyteller says they were choked by the thorns. And then there are other seeds that indeed fell on good ground, and the storyteller says those seeds produce quite a lot, some 100-fold, some 60, some 30, and so forth on that fertile ground. Now, it's a very interesting story and is very applicable in the case of what we call the taxi industry, its relationship with the state, and the taxi industry in relation with the communities, the users, right? And why I'm saying this is because the relationship between the state government and the taxi industry has always been, that of animosity. So if you look at the legislation, the environment, over the years has always been, how can we resolve animosity? How can we, we are fighting. So you see that it's always been a fight. The regulations that are there are not there to essentially, promote, the viability of this, as an industry. It's more about how can we control. So the sower went out to seed and planted seed on very good ground. Now, who's the sower in this case? Who's the seed? And the soil itself. Who is the soil? Now, I want to say that the government here has a role to play in terms of preparing the soil, the ground, so that the industry, which I believe is the seed in this case, when planted in the ground, can produce seeds. Now, what does it mean to produce, to prepare, good ground, fertile ground? Now, if you look at electricity, let's look at independent power producers, right? You look at the language that is being used with independent power producers in the Electricity Regulation Act. It says that government will buy a certain amount of electricity from the producers will buy. But when it comes to transport, we say we want to subsidize, right? Just listen to the language, you want to subsidize. It's not about buying, it's about subsidizing. Why is that the case? Aren't you buying a service? And I believe we are buying a service. Government is buying a service from the industry. Now, the change of language is very important. Now, if you look at what has happened elsewhere in the world, I mean, we do quite a lot of empirical studies. There's a multidisciplinary team that we have, the CSIR. We have, you know, a network of, you know, academics, you know, industry players and so forth. So we talk to each other, we listen, we observe, we measure and so forth. We've interacted with colleagues in Kenya, for example. They have created, you know, what is called SACCOs, savings and credit cooperatives. And some of the research shows that these cooperatives have actually been successful in terms of improving service quality, right? And they've been successful because the environment, the soil in which, you know, they are sowing their seeds is create an environment where you can flourish. Now, the service quality has improved. They, for example, being able to, in some cases, employ, you know, drivers on a full-time, you know, salary. They've been able to do a lot of things to improve, you know, service quality in a number of, you know, these circles. Now, the banking environment there is such that they allow for cooperatives to work. I think the penetration rate from what I've read is around 13% cooperatives in the banking industry. South Africa, we're talking less than 1%. I think it's 0.06% thereabout. United States cooperative banking penetration of over 50% from the research. In Ireland is very large. You're talking between 60 and 80%. Globally, you're talking 13% penetration rate of cooperatives. Now, what they do is they're saying, okay, the industry, which is the seed, is an investment arm, right? Just like the independent power producers, you know, you're sowing this seed, you're investing, and you need the returns on investment. Now, they allow for a certain return on investment for the sower, which I believe the sower, which I haven't talked about, is the community. The community needs to use the industry as a seed to be able to derive an outcome. Need to invest in it. Now, selling seeds, when the industry sells seeds, it's just for survival. The industry shouldn't be about just selling seeds. Network businesses can produce a lot more than just selling seeds. There's a lot more to networks than just selling seeds. Now, you need to be able to create an environment where you can get that return on investment. Communities need to invest in the industry to be able to generate, for example, property, you know, revenue and other non, you know, fair revenue related, you know, returns. Now, they've been able to do that to create, you know, an environment where even communities can invest in such, you know, cooperatives and get a return on investment. Now, the industry itself is large, the taxi industry, but even larger is the amount of transport, I mean, the travel that takes place in South Africa. In the peak period, for example, you're probably talking about 17 million passengers. You know, some of them walk, some of them use, you know, private cars, and some of them use taxis and so forth. Now, if taxis had to transport all the 17.5 million people in the peak, you probably need around 1.2 million in taxis. You don't have that much, right? But you need some capacity to provide that service. Now, it brings me to the point of targets. Again, it's about the soil itself. You look at independent power producers, they say we're committing to buying, say, 18,000 megawatts from the producers. Now, what are we committing to buy from the taxi industry? We're saying we want to, you know, subsidize, but what are we committing to buy? So we need to then say we want to buy this outcome. We want to buy a certain kind of service quality. We want to buy a certain kind of capacity. We want to be able to buy a certain kind of productivity, right? So we need to be able to produce those targets and say, as a system, as a transport, what is it that we are trying to do in the bigger picture? The minister talked about the economy. If you look at the economy, the transport costs about 12% of GDP, right? 12%, society pays about 12% equivalent of GDP to move people. And we shouldn't be paying more than about 7%. If you look at, you know, our trading partners, you know, countries that are like us. So it means that we've got a 5% backlog in the economy. So when we trade, we're adding an extra 5% equivalent to the trade amount, to the cost of trade. So it's a huge amount. So that gives you an idea of some of the targets that we can then, articulate and say, we want to buy this outcome, and therefore, this is the relationship that we create. This is the legislation that we create. This is the environment that we want to create. Now, the technology, taxi is just a technology, just like independent power producers. Now, they have wind, they have, solar, they have, in some cases, thermal and, hydro and all manner of things. Taxi is just a technology. Now, you want to make sure that you say, I want this kind of outcome to be able to produce this target. So the role of planning authorities, municipalities, is quite important in this. But then also, lastly, I want to come to the role of Santaco, right? Santaco needs to play a very strong role from a leadership perspective in terms of empowering the associations. Now, the associations there can be proper businesses, business that the state buys from. You buy, whatever the outcome that you need from the industry. Now, the Santaco needs to then play a part in empowering those associations, those businesses, to be able to partake in this, transactions. And that means Santaco needs to have the capacity, technical capacity to do so. It needs to be empowered to do so. It needs to be able to have project managers. This is a mega project. It's not something that you do as by the way, right? It's a mega project, and there are principles of mega projects. So you need to have that, the leadership to be able to drive this program. Now, in the absence of Santaco being able to do that, if it's inward looking and not outward looking in terms of saving, in the absence of having those targets from planning authorities, then we are going to be in this, cycle for probably forever. So we need to improve that environment, the soil, again, and then we need to improve the capacity of Santaco to drive that change, and then empower those businesses, those associations to be able to partake. Now, lastly, just in terms of, we're talking, financing of the industry, it probably needs to be faced. It needs to be faced to say, okay, here are people who walk very long distances to to train stations, right? A lot of people walk long distances, in some cases 20 minutes to access train services. Now, you want to then say, okay, I'm buying from the industry so that I improve quality of service, so that, you don't have to walk such long distances. You're buying that outcome. You're buying that outcome in terms of a relationship with the industry. Now, that becomes more sustainable. And then you can then, build on that. You can build on that, going into the future, buying from and with specific targets that you want to place. Program Director, with that, I'd like to stop. I hope it will, create a conversation.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Doc, for that food for thought. And I think a very beautiful and fitting analogy there. Some of us have not been able to go to church ever since the lockdown. So we feel revived now to at least have some sort of depiction of the scriptures represented in this discussion. But I think it's absolutely important what you touched on. Cross-pollination of ideas is absolutely vital when it comes to assessing how we can take this taxi industry into the future. I love the idea of not looking at the sector in isolation or in silos, but borrowing from our neighbors and see what we can implement this side, and also what we can export of the things that are going well in South Africa. I also think it's quite important, we the planning phase so as to be incorporated going forward. And I think if you treat then the industry in a professional manner in that way, that speaks to the preparing of the soil, like you said, the environment is able to produce a more professional taxi industry. So thank you very much for that. Let's turn our attention to Dr. Moyana now, who's also going to give us some input as it pertains to the subject matter. Doc, it's over to you.
Thank you very much, moderator. Minister Mbalula, the president of Santaco, Mr. Daibosh, thank you so much for the opportunity. Minister and the president of Santaco, I need to indicate that these engagements are long overdue. They are long overdue because if you look at the direct and indirect labor absorbing capacity of the taxi industry, as well as its passenger market share, it warrant attention. It cannot be left as an informal sector for that long. Furthermore, if interventions could be put in place to improve the quality of transport service provided by the industry, and therefore make the service more attractive, it would take a lot of private cars out of the road, of our road network, and in the process, free our roads and minimize issues of congestion, but not just congestion. You know that as we have congestion, we also have issues of air pollution, and that works adversely against our sustainable development goals. But it also delays the delivery of both people. In fact, I can in brief say it delays the delivery of the means of production, that is both labor and the final products for both consumption as well as for purposes of retail, where they are required. In fact, I went through the discussion document and I realized that there is a proposal for us to have a professional body. And I'm strongly in support of that professional body, the establishment of such. I know Santaco was intended initially, Mr. Daibosh, to serve that purpose, but I think it needs to be more formalized so that you have teeth, but it must be the kind of professional body that is to a large extent autonomous, but with legislative authority in terms of the minister having authority to legalize the establishment of such a professional body. That will enable the body to not to have teeth, to be able to have recourse just in case you've got members that are not compliant. But also the exciting thing about the body itself is the emphasis on the involvement of everybody involved. The involvement of all types of taxis. There is an adage at moderator that goes that nothing about us without us. So if you want ownership, you need to make sure that everybody is involved, everybody who will be affected or will be governed by this structure needs to be involved in terms of the establishment. But also there is a need, I think that this body once established can learn a lot from both ISO 39001, but also from our local RTMS, even though RTMS focus is the trucking industry. There is a lot of lessons, Mr. Daibosh, that you can draw from that sector. Because they were, as much as they call themselves self-regulating, they align themselves to all forms of regulations, but especially in terms of law enforcement, in terms of road safety, ensuring that the vehicles are safe. In particular, they also identify a number of criteria in terms of variables that need to be considered when they measure their own performance. In particular, they look at such things as issues of controlling loading, preventing overloads. I think that applies to you as well, because as your vehicles are overloaded, that has implications on the safety of the taxis. But also there is also an issue of safety and stroke compliance, which has a lot to do with vehicle maintenance, basic roadworthiness, speed controls, traffic violations. If you look at all these things, they've got a lot to do with road safety. They've got a lot to do with ensuring that all the passengers that you ferry are safe. They are taken from point B to point C or whatever point safe, and they reach their destination safe. And there is, as a result, a need for that. The third one is driver wellness. You know, at times we complain that our taxis or whatever vehicle gets involved in accidents, but there are other variables beyond what we see at face value. One of the things is driver wellness. If you have, for instance, drivers that have chronic conditions and they are pushed to go beyond what their system can handle in terms of driving, it has implications on their performance, and that therefore culminating in the safety of the passengers. In particular, regarding the issue of driver wellness, I'm referring to issues of medical fitness, to issues of making sure that there is a chronic illness management system. There is also fatigue management system, and also making sure that all the drivers are controlled in terms of the number of hours they can drive, but also generally the operators as well as the industry as a whole needs to establish or put in place such things as wellness initiatives for drivers. And the fourth one, which is also very interesting, is the issue of support, supporting drivers in terms of skills development to ensure that drivers obtain and retain competency to be safe. These are drivers of mass movers. As a result, they need to have all the skills to take care of everybody who's in the vehicles. And also issues of compliance, but they also need to be of minimal risk to everybody else on the road. And if for instance, we consider the fact that one of the issues raised in the discussion document is the challenge that is faced by the industry, that is violence, and as well as poor customer service. It can also, we can also add to these variables also issues of customer service as well as violence prevention. So, and also we need to bear in mind that if we look at all these criteria, there is also a principle, Dr. Mkonyama referred to issues of project management. Project management can only be successful. There is a principle that underpins the issue of project management. And the principle is that only that which can be measured can be successfully implemented. So if we do not have a mechanism to measure the services, a mechanism to measure all these criteria that I've identified above, namely support for drivers, driver wellness, as well as issues of load control and safety, there is no way we can be able to confidently tell whether our services are of any value to our clients or not. And as a result, there is therefore a need for us to introduce a mechanism to be able to measure our services. And for that reason, I further recommend, in addition to what you have in the discussion document, that we also introduce an issue using the same criteria that I referred to. We also introduce an issue of periodic auditing of operators, both operators and drivers, particularly operators themselves. We audit them in terms of the support they provide to drivers. We audit them in terms of the support they provide to ensure that there is driver wellness. We also audit them in terms of the interventions they put in place to ensure that their fleet make a significant contribution in terms of road safety. But we also audit them in terms of their compliance, in terms of load control related issues. But also because two of our additional issues that were identified, Mr. Daibosh and the Minister, is the issue of violence in the industry. So we must also be able to audit them in terms of the role they play, either in terms of minimizing violence or in terms of ensuring that violence escalates within the industry. But also, we also have an issue of customer service within the industry, poor customer service, to be precise. It is alleged that the service that is rendered by the industry is very poor, and as a result leaves much to be desired, or it needs a lot of improvement as a result. And those two can be the additional variables that we can look at in terms of auditing our operators. But we must also make sure that the operators keep records of all these things to make sure that they are audit ready all the time. And if you look at the proposal regarding the introduction of audits, that's another opportunity of creating jobs in the industry, because you will need accredited taxi industry auditors. And those can be achieved by making sure that the norms and standards that are developed by the industry are not just a by the way kind of an arrangement. They actually get registered with such institutions as the SABS, just like the RTMS did. They also get aligned to ISO 39001, so that they are comparable in terms of international good practice. They are also comparable in terms of similar industries within the country. It's for that reason that I was saying that only that which we can measure can be successfully implemented. If we do not have a mechanism to measure our services, a mechanism to measure whatever norms and standards that we come up with, it's just as good as not having them, because you will not be able to confidently account for in terms of impact. You will not be able to account in terms of areas that need improvement. You will also not be able to account in terms of those that work and those that need to be discarded. As a result, there is a need for us to have a mechanism to measure whatever intervention that we come up with. In order to ensure that this measurement does take place, we need to make sure that all the operators are required to keep and develop the copies of procedures, to also keep and develop copies of policies, records, to also conduct monitoring and implement corrective measures, as well as internal audits to encourage a culture of compliance and continuous improvement. It's only when they have these kinds of systems in place that then external audits can come in. Then external audit can come in to verify compliance with whatever set standards. In terms of the procedures, policies, and records, and everything else, templates can be developed by yourselves as the national structure, Mr. Daibosh, so that all the associations underneath are able to copy or just adapt for their purpose. And once that is done, it will make it very easy for us to be able to confidently account if, for instance, the department is to provide subsidies, as Dr. Mkonyama said. I'm begrudgingly referring to subsidies because I could see you have got your own reservations. In a way, you felt that they need full support. Then we can use this as some of the material to support our request for subsidies, for instance, to demonstrate that as a sector, we know what we're doing, to demonstrate that as an association or as associates, different associations, we know what we're doing, to demonstrate that as operators as well, we know what we're doing, and also to demonstrate that we also take care of our employees. Because one of the things that seem to be coming out that we could attribute the many accidents that we have associated with the taxi industry is probably the issue of fatigue, for instance, in terms of the drivers, the issue of neglect of their state of health. You might find that you do have those that are employable, but they have chronic conditions that need to be managed. So employers in the form of operators need to know all those things regarding the drivers that they own. But they also need to know the state of roadworthiness in terms of their fleet. And such things can be used as a justification to show that we do comply with all the legislation, with all the norms and standards as set by the industry. And that becomes a ground for us to justify more funding or whatever form of support that can come from government. But as I conclude, moderator, I need to emphasize that there is indeed a need for us to have a legislative backing of this kind of an initiative, because without that legislative backing, in cases where there is non-compliance, it will be very difficult to institute any form of recourse and to institute any form of punitive measure. But if we have both the industry specific, which can use as a form of just discontinuing the membership or disaccrediting the institution, we can also take a legal action by, for instance, stopping whatever form of subsidy that we can be thinking of in case such an operator or such a service provider, transport service provider, is not compliant with all the legislative requirements. On that note, moderator, I'll pause. I'll just take questions where there is any. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much, Dr. Moyana. I think I'm reminded by what Minister Mbalula often says about the taxi industry, that it is too big to fail. And by big, he's not only measuring its size in terms of its economic value, being at tens of billion rand worth of an industry, but also the contribution that it makes in a developmental country such as our own, the jobs that it creates, or what you have termed the direct and indirect labor absorbency capacity of the taxi industry. We often think of the industry as just the drivers, but we don't know that there are queue marshals that are there are your vendors who are there are a number of people that are linked to this industry and whose success depends on its sustainability. It is a thriving ecosystem that must be fought for in order for it to not only survive, but to also scale to higher heights. I think something also that's quite important is just the way in which all the components regarding the taxi industry are interlocked and interlinked. There's a symbiosis between the professionalization, issues of safety, issues of empowerment, all of these things find resonance in each other. And it's like a domino effect. You fix one and you get it right, very soon it leads to a domino effect that will, ripple throughout the industry and bring about change. So that brings to the fore some of the human rights issues that are interlocked and interlinked to this particular discussion. You already spoke on driver wellness and making sure that there's good employment habits when it comes to your workers in the industry, but commuters as well, and how safe, affordable, and reliable public transport is a human rights issue. I think those are issues that also need to come to the fore when we speak about unity in the industry, when we speak about leadership in the industry. And I think at that point, it's a good place for us to segue into a contribution by Professor Thuli Madonsela, who will also just give her input in terms of what we're speaking about today. And I think it's very important, Prof, that we hear from Imbokodo. We've been getting a lot of testosterone, I think, in this conversation. So let's hear from women. And I think it's something that's also very important, because we can go to great lengths about the role of women in the taxi industry, but I don't want to pigeonhole you in that particular direction. You're free to contribute as you will. Prof, it's over to you.
Thank you, Ayanda. Thank you for the kind introduction, and thank you to Minister Mbalula for organizing this Lekgotla, which is timely. I was unfortunately unable to listen to the minister, but from what I've heard from you, Ayanda, there's one thing that I picked up about saying that this industry is a sunshine industry. Sunshine is something that is everlasting. They often complain about some tenders or some state contracts being evergreen or sunshine tenders. And I do think that that pretty much describes the taxi industry. From where I'm sitting, the taxi industry is one of the pillars of our society and an important pillar of the economy. You can think of your transport system as like the veins in a body. If we think of society as a system, for society to connect effectively, you need a transport system. And that's why when China was looking at a way out of poverty as part of the Sustainable Development Goals, they targeted two things that I hope we will target in South Africa. One was transport for all, linking everyone to everything that they need to interact with, to make a living for themselves, to be able to acquire wealth, work, and their well-being. And also, China also invested in digitalization, making sure that everyone is operating on the net. And I think with the taxi industry, it is part of the veins of our society. I also, apart from the fact that the taxi industry is a backbone of our economy, personally, I have a personal soft spot for this industry. My father was a pioneer in the taxi industry. When this industry started, there were no minibuses. It was vans. My father had two vans. One was a Deutsch and another one was a Chevrolet. And they just had benches at the back of their cars. My father was in the long distance taxi industry. And therefore, if we look at this industry, you look at two things. One is innovation, because just out of adversity, these people thought about how do we transport each other? How do we link families with, how do we link those who are in the mines and all places of work with their families in a frequent way? This industry was born. But there's another thing apart from innovation that I like about this industry. There's a saying in Northern America that they thought, well, they buried us, not knowing we were seeds. Because this is an industry out of people who were buried under apartheid. Apartheid sought to destroy families so that it had surplus people. And by destroying families, then you had surplus people and a continuous supply of cheap labor. And this is one of those industries that made it possible for people to connect, for people to get home faster than they would get home if they were only using trains and railway buses. So it is really an example of innovation. It's an example of what we mean by self-made. It's also an example of what we mean by resilient entrepreneurship. However, and there's always that however, I think the industry has struggled with being agile in a changing world. And I think, yes, it is resilient and it has lasted beyond anything that has been thrown at it. But I often worry that the modern taxi industry survives through violence, through forcing people to commute through taxis. It would beat people up if they get lifts. It would beat people up. And it's just been known to become violent. And that's really sad, because as the speakers before me have said, there's so much room for this industry to adapt and pivot and diversify its services so that it can align its services with the needs of the modern society and modern economy. I mean, it could go into the spaces where there's Uber, etc. But just lastly, though, I must say that whilst I'm saying this is an industry of people who, like seeds, were buried, but they prospered underground and became a giant, and they've survived the test of time. And I also am saying this industry has failed to adapt in the modern world. It's known to be violent, it's known to be rude, and just generally, it's known not to pay taxes well. It's known for wrong reasons, and also for being disunited and with so much killings within the industry itself. Minister Mbalula, I want to say it's also an industry that has been failed by government. Democracy. This industry has not received its democracy dividend, which means this pool of entrepreneurs in our democracy and the majority of our people who use the taxi industry have not received their democracy dividend when it comes to the taxi industry. You will recall that during apartheid, we had the municipal buses that were subsidized by government. Those municipal buses continue to be subsidized by government, which makes the fares cheaper. In this particular industry, to this date, the fares are not subsidized by government, but these are government's people as well. These are people who also pay their taxes in terms of that, in terms of normal tax and the fuel levy. So that's one place where this industry has been failed. As public protector, there's another area where I investigated, and you remember this, President Taibos, that I investigated the failure of government to deal with a scheme where taxi owners were duped into buying vans that had been changed or converted into minibuses without following the right procedures, and therefore these vans became death traps. As we speak today, two things happened. The people who use taxis have lost family members because of this. But secondly, taxi owners have lost millions of rands because of this. And I remember when we did the public hearing on this matter, that there was one lady from Bumalang, I think Mama Koza, I will call him, who really left me almost in tears when she spoke about how she bought this taxi and with this minibus and wasn't told that it had been transformed from a van into a minibus. And then later, when these problems arose, she was then told that she had to go without any minibus for a period of time. I think it was going to be 6 months whilst it's being fixed. And then during that period, there was no guarantee on who was supposed to pay for the income that she was supposed to get, because the taxi was supposed to still be paid for, or rather the vehicle needed to be paid for. There was no arrangement to stop, as we did during COVID-19, the payments during the period, so that at least then she would only struggle with just income and cash flow for other things, rather than struggling with having to pay the the banks for the money she had borrowed for the taxi. So in that way, I left that report 90% complete. That just showed that government failed the taxi industry in that particular matter, on that particular matter. The industry, Toyota South Africa included, also failed the taxi industry, and the regulatory bodies, including the SABS, also failed the taxi industry. The other area where the taxi industry has been failed has been during COVID-19. We don't like that taxi drivers tend to be rude and that this industry is full of violence. But violence is the language of the disempowered, and protest is the language of the unheard. And I do believe that if we had handled the lockdown regulations properly, the taxi industry didn't have to say it was now going to disobey the rule. I must say, though, that with the taxi industry behaving like that, it shot itself in the foot in the same way as young people shot themselves in the foot when they had a good cause during the fees must fall. When they started acting against the law, they lost public support. And I think with the taxi industry, the same thing. The public just saw a group that refuses to operate within the boundaries of the law, whereas the cause they were fighting for was a good cause. Some of the rules were ridiculous and unfair. But there's a ray of hope. The ray of hope is, Minister, you're convening this Indaba, and I'm hoping that from this Lekgotla, the issues that will emerge going forward will be issues around a good leadership from the taxi industry itself, leadership that is purposeful, leadership that's purpose-driven and ethical. And from President Daibosh, it would appear that that's the direction in which the leadership is going. I'm hoping that also there'll be fair regulation, that the industry is regulated with its input being included in this process. But also there's fairness in that the democracy dividend for people who belong to this industry, either as entrepreneurs or as customers or even as employees, because the taxi industry also provides jobs, they also get their democracy dividend. From the industry itself, violence must end. And I must say that gender-based violence is a big problem, because where there's violence, women can't operate. And I do know that women taxi owners, or those who have been left to these businesses by their fathers, their brothers, or their husbands, are battling in an industry that is driven by violence. And that must stop, because we need public sympathy, we need public buy-in, because this industry is crucial. Whatever its future may be, it might not look exactly the way it looks. It might morph into something else through agility. But whatever it becomes, it is an industry that meets people where they are. There is nothing as good as the taxi industry in terms of bringing transport as close to people's doorsteps as possible. And lastly, I do hope that the taxi industry is going to find a way to leverage technology for safer environments for commuters, for safer environment for the drivers, because there's no reason why we can't have the kind of technology that makes sure that we know what's happening to a taxi at every given stage, to make sure that the drivers are safe at all times and that the commuters are safe at all times. And thank you again for this, Lekgotla, Minister, and to the industry. I do believe that the journey of 1,000 miles, as the Chinese say, begins with a single step. But in Africa, we do say that, or rather the Ethiopians say that when spider webs combine, they can tie up a lion. And here we are tying up this huge lion that is going to be part of our sustainable development pathways. Thank you.
Prof, thank you very much for your contribution. It was absolutely invaluable, and I'm sure lots of people can attest to those aha moments that were in many of your sentences there. And I think this is why we're here, just to remind those who are joining us on television or on other platforms. We're here to have those honest, those frank, solution-seeking conversations, sometimes uncomfortable even, but it just reminds me of someone who has a wound. You know, if there is a wound that is infected, that is bleeding, that has pus coming out, and that has been in that state for years, it doesn't help for us to just put a Band-Aid over it and move along. We have to stop in our tracks to clean out some of the infection that is there, to dress the wound properly, to put the ointment that is necessary. And this is why we're having these webinars and the provincial Lekgotlas to bring to the surface all the issues that are prevalent in the sector, with the aim, of course, of finding a solution. And Minister Mbalula has gone to great lengths to say he is of the view that this time next year, we'll be seeing a completely different landscape as far as the taxi industry is concerned. So it's very important that there are no holds barred in these conversations, as we just intentionally try to find solutions with a fine-tooth comb and get to some of those granular details that make the troublesome issues come to the fore. Let me also now just open up the conversation by way of questions and answers. We spoke about a lot of what is going wrong in the industry, and it is very important, as I have highlighted. But I think let's speak a little bit about the where to component. Now that we know what we know, now that we have a couple of solutions that have been suggested, what about the issue of accountability? What about consequence management? So I guess my question to the panelists now, to the three of them, and I will ask for about 2 minutes answer each on this one. Is there sufficient accountability to hold members or leaders accountable for taxi violence, for lack of leadership, or for some of the concerns that we are plagued with insofar as the industry is concerned? Dr. Muganyama, let me start with you on the issue of consequence management. What's your contribution there?
All right. Thanks, Ayanda. You know, in the 1990s, you know, the communities in Atteridgeville, in the former East Rand, Katlehong and the you know, surrounds, they held the taxi industry to account. I think in Katlehong, about 2 months, they boycotted the industry altogether. So the community was, you know, together to say, you know, we cannot have this. And after those 2 months, the industry came back and actually apologized, but certain things, you know, just continued, you know, to be the way they are. Again, going back to the soil and the soil, the ground, you know, the ecosystem itself that government has created, it results in this sort of things. For example, e-NATIS system, which is supposed to know which vehicles are registered, where are they registered, and so forth, it's got a lot of problems. I mean, I've seen a recent report around, I think Prof. Madonsela talks about that, you know, panel van, you know, investigation. You know, there were questions asked by the Portfolio Committee on Transport to say, you know, what is happening with e-NATIS? It looks like people can just go in and, you know, manipulate the numbers in the. So there were no answers from the RTMC as far as I could tell from that report. So it means that, you know, we don't know what kind of assets, we have in the system. Right, so you need to treat this firstly as an asset. So it's an industry that's an asset, be able to quantify and be able to, of course, like Dr. Moyene said, be able to measure those things. Now, what we see in Kenya, for example, and Prof. Madonsela, you know, touches on this about modernization, digitization. Now, the drivers are paid in some of these circles full salaries, right? They're paid full salaries, but what they do, and then a question comes to say, but what if they don't drive? What if they just do what they, you know, they just, you know, go haywire? They then invest in technology to monitor the drivers. They know exactly what is happening, where is the driver, and what is happening in the industry. So we need to use technology as far as possible to monitor performance. And then hold, the whole value chain, accountable, as it were. But, just as a summary, communities themselves, as the investors in the industry, need to hold the industry to account. But then also we need to invest in the technology, invest in the infrastructure to enable the industry to perform well. A taxi industry by default breaks laws because there's no infrastructure. I stop anywhere, I break a law. Whatever they do, in the network is breaking the law because there's no infrastructure. Provide infrastructure for them to be able to, uphold the law as it were. So let me stop there.
Thank you so much for that. I think it's the same question to Dr. Moyana, just to find out about measures to hold accountable those who perpetuate unrest or violence in the industry.
And thank you, moderator. I think I need to go back to what I indicated, that we need to bear in mind that we cannot arbitrarily determine whether people comply or they do not. As a result, there is a need for us to have those norms and standards, which will serve as a yardstick against which we are able to determine whether people comply or not. And in instances where, we need to categorize them such that we have those that are so severe that there is no room for us to even say, you can go and attend to this, then come back later on, we'll reconsider your membership. For instance, issues of violence. Violence involves loss of life. Violence involves, people getting injured to a point that they can no longer work for themselves. And so as a result, that one is so severe that it needs to be clearly, from the norms and standards, it needs to be clear that in instances where people are caught involved in issues of violence, it's a complete cancellation of operating license. But in instances where you find that it's issues of roadworthiness and the state of the vehicle, issues of how the extent to which people are able to look after their employees, issues of the extent to which people are able to provide development opportunities, skills development for their drivers. In such instances, they can just be suspended and be given an opportunity to go and attend to those, but with a strict condition that on return, on re-registration, they are not required to commit the same mistakes again. And if they commit the same offense, then cancellation results. Because if we become very lenient, we will just be gradually going back to what we are trying to rid the country of. That is all I can say for now, moderator. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Dr. Prof, let's bring you into the equation once again and just find out from you, in terms of what we have seen transpire by way of taxi violence. Some issues are still prevalent. I remember just traveling both to the Eastern Cape as well as the Western Cape with Minister Mbalula, addressing some of those hotspots where we have seen some unrest or skirmishes erupt there. Are you of the view that there are sufficient measures, that the regulatory framework suffices at the moment to hold to account those who perpetuate taxi violence? If you would like to see changes, how would you like to see those consequent management mechanisms changed?
Thank you, Ayanda. I would say the regulatory framework for accountability is sufficient, but the implementation is not. I think the implementation is hampered by corruption, politics, and intimidation of whistleblowers. If we can, of course, then make sure that we eliminate corruption, we depoliticize law enforcement, and thirdly, we protect whistleblowers, things could be better. Again, during my term as public protector, one of the areas where there was taxi violence was Ekurhuleni. And it was clear that part of the problem was that those who were supposed to enforce the law, those who were supposed to make sure that people comply with their certificates, with their transport authority certificates, did their job. They didn't always do that, in that you would find that the police also fear some of the kingpins of taxi violence. But also, we found that a lot of it had to do with politics. If people were politically connected, there seemed to be a problem in holding them to account. And then there was also a problem of protecting whistleblowers, because if they tell the truth, they're going to be arrested. I do want to support what was said by Dr. Mokonyane about the need to use technologies. There's something that is called a black box. A lot of cars that you hire from Avis and the car hire companies have a black box that tells you what's happening to the car at any given stage. And again, with the taxi driver, if we insisted that every taxi has a black box, we will make sure that there isn't overcrowding in the taxis. We would also, the owners would also make sure that the taxi driver only goes where they're supposed to do, and they also don't underreport on the number of trips that they've taken. But again, it goes back to a partnership between the taxi industry, civil society, and government, because these changes will need some subsidization. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I know that we do have Mr. Taibosh, who's been listening very intently and would like to also make a contribution before we close. We'd also like to hear from Minister Mbalula before we close. So I'm just going to ask, I suppose, the last round of questions from our panelists. We'll then hear from Mr. Taibosh and also hear from Minister Mbalula. I'm going to ask this question as direct and frank and open and honest as I possibly can. I myself, as a spokesperson, have fielded a similar question, and I now put it to you today. Do you think there is the possibility of having a taxi industry completely free from violence? And by violence, I mean violence against one another over routes. I mean violence against women and women's bodies. I mean violence in terms of the manner of approach to customer service, as Professor Chilima Donsela has mentioned. So that is just the context, but the question is very simple. Is it possible, really, to have a taxi industry free from violence? I'm going to continue with the order and start with you, Dr. Mokonyane. Is it possible?
It is indeed possible, and we've seen it, but it does require quite a bit of leadership. But then also some amends. I think we've been continuing on a trajectory that never had amends. I mean, people were killed. I hear President Santaco apologizing and saying, there were a number of things that happened, but we never really, reconciled. You have people walking around who have killed. You have, people who are walking around who have, destroyed families. So we never really, healed. So that is needed. We need that break, an acknowledgement that things went wrong, and this should not happen again. And that should be implemented together with the business model that you're talking about right now. You want to buy a service from the industry. You're not necessarily subsidizing. You want to buy a service that has got targets. You've got planning authority that buys service with targets. So we need those amends, and make sure that it doesn't happen again. Finance the industry appropriately, because if we don't do that, it becomes very unsustainable. And then very important also is to note that as it is, the industry is just surviving. It costs about 8 rands, probably 8 rands a kilometer to run the service. And that you need to probably sell around 140 seats in a day. That's very difficult currently. So, the reform of the financing model, very important. but then also those amends going forward. And we have seen it. We've got some few examples. If you see the likes of the Rustenburg, there's a Rustenburg initiative, cooperative bank, that they are trying to mobilize. You need initiatives like that, leadership like that, to say there's a bigger reason why we exist. It's not just about selling seats. It is about creating capital, value for the communities that we serve.
Thank you so much, Doc. Dr. Moyana, unity and peace in the taxi industry, is it a pipe dream or a possibility?
Thank you once more, moderator. It is very more than possible, actually. But one of the critical ingredients of the possibility is that we need to have a representative leadership, structure, so that there is ownership of all the initiatives that the structure comes up with. Because if there are those that feel like they are not part of this structure, if there are those that feel they are not part of the decision-making process, then they tend to try to sabotage whatever effort that is being put in place. But also there is a need to have some kind of an arrangement where you've got a stick and carrot kind of an arrangement, where you've got a mechanism to incentivize those that are not violent, but also there must be consequence management for those that commit any form of violent act, so to serve as a way of preventing or deterring any form of violence within the industry. But having a successful violent-free industry, it is more than possible. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Doc. Prof, a violence-free taxi industry, are we being overly optimistic here, or is this something feasible in your opinion?
It is possible, Ayanda, to have a violence-free taxi industry. And I think all of the conditions that have been stipulated by my colleagues, Dr. Mokonyama and Dr. Moyana, must prevail. I particularly like the idea that everyone must be involved in the peace process. We have to make sure that everyone is around the table. And I particularly think that the women in the taxi industry should be included in the peace table. I also agree with the suggestion that we have to look at some kind of reconciliation process where there's an acknowledgement of what has happened in the past, and there is some kind of restoration. And the parties can determine what it would take, but there has to be a way of recognizing what has happened, resetting the agenda and building going forward. Lastly, I do agree also with the suggestion that there has to be push and pull factors. We want peace, but people don't change unless there's a reason to change. So there has to be something they're running away from, and there's something they are running towards. And consequence management, as you said, Ayanda, needs to be implemented. And I think if we depoliticize the process, if we protect whistleblowers and use technologies like black boxes to find out what's happening in the industry, we can make sure that there is consequence management. And then I also do agree with the idea that there has to be some incentives. And what better incentive really than an industry that gets its democracy dividend when it comes to subsidization, because it really is the veins of society, or it's part of the veins of society. The transport system is part of the veins of society. They are providing space for entrepreneurship. They're providing space for jobs. They're also getting us to where we need to go. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Prof. I think let's hear from president of Santaco now, Mr. Taibosh, who's been furiously taking notes, making sure that he's not only paying attention so that he can respond, but so that he can listen and understand and also take to heart some of the suggestions that have been made. But I know personally that there are also some progressive steps that he would like to share with us. So perhaps President Taibosh, let's bring you into the equation. I'm going to ask you, just by way of a conclusion, to speak to us a little bit about what you've gleaned and gathered from today's conversation in about 5 minutes or so, and then we can throw to Minister Mbalula to wrap for us, please.
I must thank the minister really for this particular platform. That is, and I hope that my colleagues are listening or are watching at home. This is a very educative discussion that is undertaken here. And I want to thank the 3 panelists, Professor Madonsela, Dr. Mkonyama, and Dr. Moyam, for being very open. But also I want to indicate that our minister has shown the guts of coming forward. You know, Professor Madonsela and the other colleagues, you are talking about the taxi industry that that needs to be incentivized for it to change. I will tell you that that's not what the taxi industry needs. What the taxi industry needed, it's what was started by government in 1995. When government brought the taxi industry together, and you know, the excitement coming out of that process in 1996, you began to see the sliding of violence within the taxi industry, because suddenly there was something which was called the standard constitution, the interim standard constitution in the country at the time, which has a very thin line to say that as a taxi operator, if you transgress on 1, 2, 3, you may lose your rights to operate a taxi. But it was also even going to the association to say to the association, if you make life difficult for your members to participate within the association stands a chance of being deregistered if it is found guilty. Those are things, if we have kept to them, I believe that they would have contributed a lot towards the changes within this industry. For instance, let me indicate, and I want to challenge you to go back and look into this history. You know, if you look into immediately after 1996, there was a subsidizing subsiding of violence in the country. And during 2001, when after the launch or the establishment of Santaco, to up to 2006-07, you saw again the gradual upstage of violence in the country. What was the problem? The problem, it's the standard constitution was prohibiting government employees from being taxi operators. It was prohibiting law enforcement officers to participate and become taxi operators. During that time, you would see how many government officials, how many traffic officials, how many SAPS have joined the taxi industry, and you would find out that in the most taxi routes where this particular society came in, that things started changing and violence started becoming the order of the day, instead of, you know, saying that you've got all these people and violence will go down. So, but I don't want to regress, go back to that particular issue. I want to say that what I'm looking at, it's that Minister Mbalula has discovered something that the taxi industry has been talking about all this time. And please forgive me, they say you must give due to where it is really supposed to go to. Minister Mbalula came and he said, you know what is your problem, taxi industry? Besides talking about empowerment, the minister said, you need regulations. You need regulations so that you can be regulated like any other law-abiding person in this country. And I want to say today that I believe that if we can go back and become serious in regulating the industry, in ensuring that the structures of the industry that are there, which are the associations, your regional structures, your provincial structures of Santaco and Santaco, that those structures have teeth like your law societies, like your medical councils, you would see a drastic change within this industry. Yes, Professor Madonsela, we have discovered that we are a very wealthy industry, black industry in this country. But what we have not arrived at is to understand the value of our wealth. And I think the problem that we are sitting with is to look at the taxi license and to look at the routes that we are operating. And we are not looking at other spin-offs from within the taxi industry. We were making, for instance, very rough sums. And we came to a conclusion that the taxi industry, and it was confirmed by a lot of other experts, that the taxi industry is about a 40 billion rand per annum industry. But where is this 40 billion rand? It's not within the hands of the industry. The other thing, Minister, which I believe that the Lekgotla may come out with, is to stop the duplication of positions within the taxi industry. And I'll make an example about myself. I don't belong to any, I belong to an association, but I don't have a position in an association. I don't have a position in a region. I don't have a position in the province. I belong to the national structure. Well, I get my mandate from the association. I get my mandate from the region and the province, but I belong to the national structure. As I'm speaking here, I'm not speaking on behalf of any association or any province that I come from. I'm speaking on behalf of the entire country. And I want to believe that if all the leadership can be elected in that particular format, so that we don't get scared that when you don't attend an association meeting, that you will be sort of, immediately suspended or even disrespected in that association. And that's where I believe that the issue of unity and leadership becomes very paramount for this taxi industry. And the other thing which Dr. Moyana spoke about, Dr. Moyana, government did everything in its power to bring the taxi industry together in 2001. And we all agreed with government that we need to elect a body that is representative of all and that is representing the taxi industry in the country. Again, I will tell you that because of the interference that came from government, the taxi industry was taken back to square one, because now you get somebody who is not a member of the taxi industry who's questioning the authority of the leadership that is elected, instead of leaving that kind of things to the leadership of the taxi industry. The democracy that has taken place in the taxi industry has been respected up to a particular point, and I'm not going to point fingers to say where did it come from, but I'm saying that it comes from within our government. And I want to even go to the extent of saying, Minister Mbalula, you came in when all your other colleagues have spoken about the possibility of implementing the subsidies in the taxi industry. And you came in and you say the subsidization in the taxi industry is possible. And I can tell you that that has brought a lot of excitement, a lot of interest from the taxi industry. We can begin to look into our own businesses. We will be making a particular presentation to the minister very soon about what is it that we think can take this taxi industry forward. But what I want to appreciate from all the colleagues who have spoken here is that you are right, guys. You are right, Professor Dr. Mkonya. You are all right, Dr. Moyang, that the taxi industry needs to be given a space whereby government comes and dictates certain terms, legal terms, and the taxi industry must then begin to take its course forward and ensure that it professionalizes the industry itself. It makes sure that, we've got these people who are very important to this taxi industry, but who we don't appreciate the driver because we think all the time that the driver is stealing our money. But what is it that we did to ensure that we can be able to work together with our drivers? We've got queue marshals. This industry, Minister, is responsible for close to 1 million people as far as employment is concerned. You look at your hawkers in the taxi ranks. Would there be hawkers if the taxi industry was not there? No. And you look at your queue marshals. You look at the guys who are washing vehicles at the taxi rank. I am looking forward to this taxi Lekgotla to say this taxi Lekgotla is going to help us uncover ourselves as a taxi industry, to say that we need to put a council that will have powers to say when Taibos has transgressed, that Taibos should be punished to an extent whereby Taibos can be expelled from the industry. For instance, we've got cases where, I don't know how to approach women in South Africa, the rape cases that has taken place in the taxi ranks, those perpetrators are coming back after they served their terms in jail. They are working again in the industry. So the industry must reach a point where they can ban Taibos from participating in any industry structures. I think we will see changes, Ayanda, in this particular industry. I am looking positively to what the Lekgotla will bring. Companies that are selling vehicles to us, they all see us, even oil companies, every company, they all see us as the best consumers, because we don't even sit down and think, how can we become serious business people where all the things that we are consuming, we are buying from our own companies, our own spare shops, even the vehicles. How do we ensure that we produce a vehicle that is suitable for this industry, where we are not advised by any other person except the experts within South Africa to say this vehicle is suitable for the taxi industry? I believe, Minister, the Lekgotla is going to assist in a huge way. And I must indicate that the experts that you brought here, they have even given me more enthusiasm to want to go forward and to want to see that the Lekgotla comes to an end. And after the Lekgotla, we've got the regulations, Minister, whereby if Taibos is a killer or Taibos is an inciter of violence in the taxi industry, that Taibos can be effectively dealt with and can be removed from the taxi industry, both as a driver and owner, even the queue marshals, that they can know that if you get dismissed within the taxi industry, you might be published in all the taxi ranks in South Africa, where we say you can no more drive a taxi or you can no more own a taxi. Ayanda, I think I'm very appreciative of this platform that has been created by the minister. And we are looking forward as a taxi industry to seriously participate in the Lekgotla and to see a serious change coming to this Black-owned industry that can bring a lot of employment. The present employment that we are bringing to the, that I'm talking about, it's just a drop out of a teaspoon. We can bring more, and we can ensure that most of our people are working for a Black industry like the taxi industry. Thank you.
Thank you so much, President Taibosh, for that. I believe we do have a minute or two to take questions. Thereafter, we'll have Minister Mbalula wrap for us. There is a question that came in via Pastor Gregory Rockman. He's the founder, president of Pop Group. I'm going to ask the technical assistant, Ndibo Maginya, just to assist me there with regards to the hands that have been lifted and the questions that we can take. I'm not sure how to facilitate that on my end, but Ndibo, I believe you'll be able to locate Pastor Rockman and just ask him to then be very brief with his question.
Yes, I will be able to. Let me allow
Pastor Rockman, I'm not sure if you're able to participate on your end, or perhaps just maybe send through the question, and I'm happy to read it on my side.
Hello, Ayanda.
There we go. I heard you just in the nick of time. I was just about to move on. Pastor, the floor is yours. Please be brief and ask your question, please. Hello, Pastor Rockman, I can hear you. Please continue.
Can you hear me, Ayanda?
I can hear you. Go ahead. Thank you.
Thank you, Ayanda. Thank you to the minister and his panel. My question is very clear that I want to ask Ayanda. If I look at the taxi industry, and you know, we all just hear the negative about the taxi industry, but we never heard the positive things of the taxi industry. You know, look at COVID-19. It was the taxi industry that kept the economy going. There was no bus, there was no train, there was no plane. But the way we speak, it's if this is just a negative industry. Now, in the industry, the Rustenburg, you know, taxi owners, as well as the Nelson Mandela taxi owners, of which I'm a part, we have designed our own AFC, the Automated Fare Collection System, and our own Advanced Passenger Transport Management System. And that is to do exactly what Prof. Badonsela was saying. How do we monitor behavior? How do we monitor, you know, passengers? How many are they in that vehicle? How do we, you know, find that this vehicle is traveling? And did this vehicle really work? So these things have been designed locally by the taxi industry. You know, Ms. Kibi Manana was in Rustenburg with us on the 11th of March this year, just before the lockdown. We showed her the system. She and Bafana and the others that were there, it blew their minds away. And the last point is, in the Nelson Mandela Metro, there was a project that the industry and the ANC government worked together with to find unity, and that made the killings and everything to subside. We formed a structure where there's one structure where everybody belongs to, the owners and the drivers will be employed into that structure. And the drivers was excited. We did the audit of the owners, the vehicles, the drivers, their skills and everything. That was in 2014. But when the DA came in 2016, where the 10 associations was one under the banner of La Pumilanga, they said, no, we want to play divide and rule. We don't want a La Pumilanga that's a united structure. We want to speak to individual associations. And then they started paying people. And you know, when money is involved, you find that there's going to be problems. I'm asking the question, and we said to Mr. Ibrahim Sidat, why are you allowing this, which is a senior person there, and it just kept on allowing it. So government officials are also playing a role in this very same divisions that are in this industry, while the industry wants to come together. And I pray to God. I know Minister Fikile Mbalula. He's a man, he's principled, he's hardworking, and he wants to see the right thing. Minister, it is people in the industry that you have to have on these panels. Please, at the Lekgotla, bring the right people. My question is, where is NTA, National Taxi Alliance? Why are they not on this panel? You cannot have this type of things, because you know what? Tomorrow, I'm a member of Santaco. Tomorrow, you'll find that NTA will start fighting with Santaco because they will say, no, the minister favors you and we are not favored. So my plea is, there is solutions in this industry. Our model is very simple: unity, no killings, that all owners must be shareholders, that all drivers must be employed, within the industry, and they must be paid a good salary in terms of the Wage Determination Act, because I'm a trade union leader and I stand for those type of things, to respect workers, and those workers must work specific hours. There is a wage determination in terms of the hours that they must work. It's there. And I'm saying, why are the buses, which are just about 10% of transporting our people, are being subsidized? But us, we're almost 80%, not 66, we're almost 80%, in terms of this public transport. We are transporting our commuters. We are transporting our children. In this new system that we are designing, we are going to, as the industry, subsidize the elderly, subsidize students, subsidize, university college graduates, and we are going to make sure that whether we get a subsidy or not, we are going to look after our people. Our people deserve better. They deserve safe transport. They deserve that whoever, is operating a vehicle is well-trained in customer care, is well-trained in how to deal with our people. And we also have established our own training academy. Our own training academy we have established to train our people, to qualify our people, and so that our people, is just delivering the best. In Rustenburg have even taken a step further, whereby they have created a driver qualification with TITA, where you must have the driver qualification before you can get behind the taxi wheel as we are going forward. This industry is, as like Comrade Taibos was saying, it's a multi-billion industry. Please let this industry become, the sunrise, as Minister Mbalula says, in making sure us as Black people, that we also become, big, industrialists, big commercial people. Like Mr. Nteta, and I'm ending here. Mr. Nteta, we saw him at CSIR, and we said to him that we want to work with the CSIR to manufacture our own equipment of our system that we have designed. And those are the kind of things, and I want to challenge Mr. Nteta, in terms of this, so that we don't just stay at talk, but we move it forward beyond just the word of talk. So thank you, Minister. Thank you, Ayanda. Thank you to the panel. I love what you have discussed. It opens our minds, but also there are certain things that we are saying, this industry, at the association level, they are disciplined. Can I tell you, when a commuter complains, the driver get disciplined, or the owner, or they get fined. People don't know about those things. If you are not on a particular route that you're not supposed to be, we impound your vehicle, and you'll have to pay a fine, to get your vehicle back.
You've touched on so many things, Pastor Rockman. I must thank you and just interject there, just for the purposes of time. Much appreciated. And I think this is why it's so important that similar discussions are being held across the provinces, as many of our speakers have already alluded to. And just to remind those who perhaps are just joining us at the tail end of this conversation, that these discussions, this public discourse platform, will culminate into a national Lekgotla where resolutions will be taken and steps towards building the taxi industry of the future will then be taken. And we are hoping to then see tangible results next year in in black and white, but I don't want you to take my word for it. Perhaps by way of closing, Minister Mbalula, you could address the pastor's concerns. You could also speak to some of the issues that the panelists have raised, Mr. Taibosh as well. And this question very quickly coming in from Lekgotla from ENCA. It links very closely to what the pastor is saying. Lekgotla wants to know whether or not the minister can respond to Mr. Taibosh and how Santaco wants to be a body that will enforce regulation. There's a lot, Minister, that has been raised. Perhaps pick on one or two items there and give us a response before we conclude. It's over to you, Minister Mbalula.
Thank you, Ayanda, and the panelists. I think it must be noted that the people who are expert in the panel and the president of Santaco are people who are doing a lot of work in terms of public transport in the Republic. I think earlier on you did speak to that in introducing people in the panel. Professor Madonsela, for instance, when she was public protector, she did a lot of work in our space, and she's knowledgeable in terms of the challenges that the taxi industry is failing. So we're not just grabbing people, bringing them to the panel who have got no knowledge about what they are talking about. And as a public protector, I think you go to the detail of investigating and making proposals. And we're sitting with some of those proposals, and we're considering them today as we prepare for this Lekgotla. And the professors and the doctors in the panel equally, they are very much knowledgeable and have contributed a lot in terms of research to solutions. And the president of Santaco is the president of Santaco. NTA is invited. They've got issues in terms of participating in our platforms, but they are invited. So we looking forward to getting them in other platforms on their own to participate and shape the industry. At the end of the day, if you own a taxi and you belong or not belong to an organization, we want you to make a contribution. Because what is going to come out of the Lekgotla, whether people come or don't come, is going to have a meaning to how we're going to shape up in terms of this particular industry. Now, first question about legislative intervention. It's not a question. It's a point that has been raised, cutting across. The proposal in the document is introducing an empowerment provision in law for the minister to recognize Santaco. It's a point that some people agree with, others don't. In that manner, regulations can empower Santaco to exercise effective oversight on areas they are mandated to provide leadership on. Dr. Mukonyama makes an important point that we need to create an environment for the industry to flourish. We fully agree with that. As an integral part of network industries, the taxi industry will look at creative and sustainable ways to ensure that the support we provide to the industry addresses a 5% premium transport costs add to the economy. The empowerment model also we're talking about will look closely at this matter. Overall, we are going big. We're thinking about a cooperative bank. That is what we're talking about. And an independent also bank in terms of the proposals. And our experts are working on this model together with the Treasury as to what is feasible for us in terms of this industry. I have Dr. Moyani's point about professional body empowered to exercise oversight with power to enforce the rules is in line with the proposal on the table. Various options are explored in the discussion documents on how such a body can be empowered through legislative intervention. Dr. Muyani also makes an important point about workers in the industry, particularly drivers, and the president of Santaco was breaking it down to us as to who are those people we are referring to. We have been emphatic that formalizing the industry includes compliance with labor laws and ensuring that conditions of service of workers are in line with the basic conditions of Employment Act. And this includes skills development and the professionalization of the industry. Recommendations about introducing audits and issues like that, Santaco should focus on. We welcome those particular contributions in terms of the discussion. The regulatory framework is weak, Prof, at the present moment. In strengthening this framework, there will be critical trade-offs that have to be made both by government and the industry. This includes a firm commitment to the centrality of the rule of law. Government must also be fair in the application of the rules in that issuing of operating licenses as a big issue must be within the provisions of the law and prescribed timeframes. Currently, many operators continue to operate with receipts. The president will know that, and everybody in the industry knows that, despite the fact that the law requires that operating licenses must be issued within 90 days. So there's a lot of fly-by-night, Gregory Rockman, pastor, that is going on around here. We say we've got 137,000 people in the E90s, but we know we've got way above that. I mean, to about 300,000, and that is why there is conflict. It's territorial battles. Professor Madonsela makes a profound point about how the industry has not received its democracy dividend. This is the starting point in our commitment, Prof, to reimagine the taxi industry of the future. That plays a major role in the economy. The democracy dividend must include an overhaul of the subsidy system inherited from the apartheid state and ensure that the taxi industry benefits from government support in a meaningful way. This also includes a deliberate effort to empower the industry such that it owns its own value chain, the production of the taxis and so on, and benefit from that. Manufacturing, right through to maintenance and retail of both vehicles and components. I mean, that's what we're looking at. So this taxi Lekgotla, we're looking for a deal between ourselves as government and the taxi industry on these issues. Regulation, formalization, empowerment model, unity, and once we achieve this, professionalization will kick in because we are agreed on the fundamentals. And I think we have said to the industry, and the response have been magnificent. I was in the Western Cape. All sorts of proposals are coming up, and our teams are working on, solidifying that into proposals that must be debated between us and the leadership of the industry, all of them. And we agree on those, and we go to the Lekgotla and take decisions on fundamental questions. Lekgotla, when we arrive, it's not gonna be to reopen the discussion. It's gonna be saying, here is the problem. How do we deal with the problem from a point of view of the proposals? So in this webinar, some of the contribution you have made and proposals I was speaking to from your contributions will be taken on board going forward. This is a sunrise industry, and we're looking forward to basically making it the point that it does operate well. Nelson Mandela, as I conclude, says, let freedom reign, liberate all our people. And if we liberate people, taxi industry must demonstrate what the democratic dispensation has done for the Black industry and for Black people. and the poorest of the poor, the commuters, and all of that. So government can't put a blind eye and look away from the industry with all its problems and difficulties. But we must say the positives out of it is that this industry has carried the nation for a longest period with all these bigger challenges we've got, which we seek to resolve. And thank you very much to all the panelists, and thank you for your contribution. And I know we'll make even a bigger contribution going forward as we arrive at the Lekgotla in the next 2 weeks. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Minister Mbalula. Our thanks also goes out to Santaco President Philip Taibosh, as well as our esteemed panelists, Dr. Mokonyama, Dr. Moyana, as well as Professor Madonsela. Prof, I'll leave with these words that you reminded us of, that a journey of 1,000 miles begins with one step. And if we walk together, we will go further. Thank you very much. And the webinar is adjourned. Thank you.